Take a listen to this and see if you can guess who's playing. Believe it or not, that was Pat Metheny. Usually he brings a few things to mind, like jazz guitarist with that amazing mellow tone, beautiful hollow body guitars, giant hair, black and white striped sweaters, and that weird picking technique. But one thing I never think is avant-garde noise rock. But guess what? Pat has some very, very strange music that goes pretty far outside the box. We just listened to a clip from his 1994 release called Zero Tolerance for Silence, and thanks to the Make Weird Music social media community for pointing me to this album. There's a fun story about it on Wikipedia. In short, music critic Tim Griggs theorized it as Metheny's, quote, way of saying screw you to the label, and end his contract with Geffen Records. Metheny dispelled this theory 14 years after the album's release by saying, I would never do something like that. That record speaks for itself in its own musical terms. To me, it is a 2D view of a world in which I am usually functioning in a more 3D way. It is entirely flat music. The first track, titled Part 1, is straight out of the Dillinger Escape Plan songbook. I mean, just add Chris Penny's bombastic drums, and you're done. But do it for over 18 minutes, and while the Dillinger guys are still in high school. Honestly, I didn't believe this was actually a Metheny track until I saw enough evidence to suggest otherwise. Now, the second track will please Henry Cow and Fred Frith fans. It evolves over time into a strange blues rock jam that's interesting, but also sounds like 5 intentional guitarists noodling together at Guitar Center. The third part actually resonated with me because I've recorded pieces of music like it. It's hard to explain, but it's dark and really connecting the fingers with how the guitar is potentially really sloppy if you play it the right way. And this continues into part 4, but this track is way more riff-driven. It's got great drive and rhythm, and it's an actual toe tapper if you can get past the dissonance. Now the fifth and final part introduces acoustic guitar, and lots of what I'll call intonational flexibility. Like at its heart, there's a really beautiful piece of music like we'd expect from Pat. But since this is a 2D view of how he sees the world, it's familiar while missing an axis. So it's almost as if Salvador Dali painted a typical Metheny song and then Pat played that. So Zero Tolerance wasn't a critical success, and frankly, who freaking cares about critical success? I'm going to guess it wasn't a financial success either, but Metheny's most adventurous fans say it's his greatest work. Now, of course, there's a huge number of his fans who think it's a waste of time and are convinced that the Geffen record deal rumor was true. As usual with releases like this, it's quite polarizing. And I am grateful that it exists. The world needs more established artists exploring these fringe boundaries. In fact, on his website, someone asked if he notated any of it or if it was fully improvised. He said some of it was written out, but not in conventional notation, which reminds me of the insane scores I've seen Ryan Caraher post on Instagram. I asked avant-garde musician and Metheny collaborator Greg Bendian about this disc and how to listen to it. Here's what he had to say.
When is music about notes, and when is music about sound? And when is music about both? And I think that with Zero Tolerance for Silence, 1992 recording, released in 94, that Pat Metheny is really asking that question, and in such a pure way, because he's exploring the guitar in a way, the way a kid would, like a kind of wild-eyed beginner at the guitar who actually has tons of chops, because all of it's masterfully executed, conceived. I know that some people are thrown by the intonation issues, but to me it creates such an incredible vibrational atmosphere that it puts me in the mind of Harry Partch and his special tuning system and his string instruments like the harmonic canon. So I think that really the way to go into Zero Tolerance for Silence is with an open mind and not thinking of it necessarily as a Pat Metheny record, but as a record by a super adventurous guitarist who's trying to ask himself, well, if you did everything right, it would sound this way. But what if you did everything wrong or any other way than what's considered the correct way? What would that be like? What would you come up with then? That's really what Zero Tolerance is like for me.
Another Polarizing release from Metheny includes a 3-disc release called The Sign of 4, which features Derek Bailey, Greg Bendian, and Paul Wertico. If you're unfamiliar with Derek Bailey, he's one of the earliest players in the free improvisation and free jazz movements. In other words, a lot of his releases are pretty out there. Bailey has worked with all of the, quote, popular, names in the weirdest of weird music, like Fred Frith, John Zorn, Henry Kaiser, Jamie Muir, and a ton of others. Lots of people listen to Bailey's performances and they say, this isn't music, this is noise. But avant-garde fans don't always prioritize the idiomatic musical experiences of rhythm, harmony, or melody. Instead, it's more about interactions and textures and dynamics, improvisation, and other aspects that mainstream listeners deprioritize. Like any other music, it evokes emotions, but it can be difficult to face and identify with those emotions. And that's exactly what we have with The Sign of 4. Now, I'll be honest with you, the first time I listened to all 3 of these discs, I didn't get it. But in preparation for this video, I listened again, and I have to say, I still don't get it, but I appreciate it a little more. And a fun anecdote, I found out the other day that our very own Andre Chumley was in the audience for the live performance on Disc 3, and you can hear him shouting Derek Bailey's name at the end of the last track. So I asked Greg about this album too, and how listeners should approach it.
Well, the story behind The Sign of 4 and the meeting of Pat Metheny and Derek Bailey, quite an historic one, goes back to the fact that I was playing with Derek Bailey right out of college in 1983 into 84, around the time I started playing with improvisers on the Lower East Side like John Zorn and Tom Cora. And Derek and I had been playing together for about 9 or 10 years when we recorded this album, Banter, which is a series of duets with Derek and I improvising, usually using different setups for my percussion each piece. I like to break things up that way. And then right around the same time became friends with the drummer from the Pat Metheny group, Paul Wertico, and we made an album together of duets for percussion and different percussion setups called Bang. This is also available on Spotify. So when I was hanging out with Paul, I got to talking with him, got to meet Pat Metheny, of course, and the late great Miles Lyle Mays. And around that time, I just came up with this crazy idea of what about me and Paul and Derek and Pat as a quartet. And I went up to Paul and Pat and I said, what do you think of this idea? And they said, yeah, let's do it. So we ended up setting dates that didn't work out initially back in '96. And Derek was ill. We didn't know at the time that this was part of what will be his ongoing illness, but we did reschedule for right before Christmas in '96, and we put out this album, The Sign of 4. This was all improvised music and the first time that Derek and Pat had played together. It was a lot of music. The plan was to go into the studio for part of the time and to record live part of the time. And we did about 2 days each of both before we decided what we had. Took some time to listen to it, and then in post-production, Pat and I went into the studio to mix it. The live stuff I feel is really cool, but the place to start listening to this record is not with disc 1. It's with disc 3, the purple one. In Quest of a Solution is the final track on the album. Start with the last track on the album if you want to get an idea of what it was like when Pat Metheny met Derek Bailey. But there's tons of different percussion on this record. There's a lot of acoustic guitar, exotic guitar stuff from Pat, acoustic sitar guitar, his Picasso guitar mixing with Derek's electric guitar, Derek's acoustic guitar mixing with Pat's guitar synthesizer. And it was my idea to call this thing The Sign of Four, because I'm a big Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes fan. And so I wanted to even come up with, this logo for the band would be the sign of the band. And all of the titles for the 3 discs are all based off of references to the story, The Sign of Four, the great mystery of Sherlock Holmes. And so you have titles like The Aurora on disc 2, which I highly recommend. Largely acoustic number. So if you don't start with disc 1, you'll be fine. But I recommend starting with disc 3, working back into disc 2, which is the studio record, and then maybe if you feel like going all the way, go to disc 1. So I know that's kind of a backwards way of looking at it, but trust me.
One of my favorite indicators about this record, there are as many 1-star reviews as there are 5-star reviews on Amazon. And there are barely any 3-star reviews. The jazz-loving Metheny fans don't appreciate the lack of discernible music. And the avant-garde-loving Bailey fans don't appreciate Metheny dipping his toes into avant-garde and being mixed louder than Bailey. Now, I generally believe that when you can't please both sides, you're probably doing something right. In this case, I really don't know. I'm not qualified to evaluate this music, but I do know that these 4 artists are masters in their craft. Let's listen to a clip. Now, Metheny is definitely a guitarist who doesn't fit in a box, but at least 80% of his music is identifiable as Pat Metheny. But then there's the album he did with saxophonist Ornette Coleman called Song X, which I'd say is the gateway drug for Metheny fans into that lesser known and not as well understood realm. It features Jack DeJohnette on drums and Charlie Hayden on upright bass. Now, Song X is a way more straightforward jazz album. Until it isn't. There are melodies and plenty of toe-tapping moments, crazy solos, and a lot more meat for someone with more conventional listening expectations. So definitely check out the 20th anniversary release, which has 2 X's in masking tape on the cover.
Well, the thing about Song X is it's a masterpiece. A masterpiece of free jazz, a masterpiece of jazz, a masterpiece of fusion music, bringing together different worlds. And I saw the Song X tour, Jack DeJohnette on drums, Donato Coleman on percussion, Charlie Hayden on bass, Ornette and Pat out front. And it was a life-changing experience. They played all this music that really was kind of in the spirit of Ornette, but Pat had brought his own thing to it as well. And just that dream rhythm section of Jack and Charlie. Fun tunes, really strange synclavier guitar sounds. But when the 20th anniversary came out and Pat put all the bonus tracks right in front, I thought that was one of the most mind-blowing ideas of all time for production. He didn't put them at the end as bonus tracks. He put them right at the front. And that changed the whole way that you listen to the record. Because they're just back to back, boom, 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 all these tunes, these Ornette and Pat tunes hitting you from, just completely left field. So to me, Song X is a masterpiece, but also I saw the concert, and when they encored with Endangered Species, it went on for about 30 minutes and the audience left, and they apparently, according to Pat, had played it on tour several times where they played until there was no one left in the theater. So I just thought I'd mention that. And if you want to talk about extreme is one thing, but that's another kind of extreme.
I want to close with Pat's excellent response to someone's complaint about Zero Tolerance for Silence. He says, anyone who is alienated by that record, or any of the others for that matter, is welcome to their own musical world that we all are in the continuous process of defining for ourselves, whether listeners or players. I guess my point is that no rationalization is necessary when it comes to playing the music that one likes. That's such a great answer. So, thanks to Greg Bendian for his input on this video. Check out the interview we just did with him and look through his tremendous discography. His Interzone projects are a great place to start.